So welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to scholars, labor, and civil society activists about the recent turn to the so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. And I'm thrilled that today we have with us Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood about a recent announcement by the Canadian government to dedicate $1.48 billion to mobilize climate-focused investment in vulnerable regions of the world. So Hadrian is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He's an advocate for pro-public solutions to funding climate initiatives and public goods rather than corporate incentives. He's written in various forums about the need to update the mandate of Canada's main existing public bank, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, as well as the Canada Growth Fund. He's argued that rather than trying to de-risk private investment, these institutions should be offering funding and low-cost loans to governments and communities, especially those most affected by the transition to net zero, in order to support community-led public interest initiatives. And he is definitely, therefore, an ally and friend of the Blended Finance Project. So welcome, Hadrian.
Oh, thanks so much for the invitation.
Great. So in this project, we're documenting how blending public money is used to leverage private money to shift the risk of investment from the private to the public sector by subsidizing commercial actors. You've spoken about these mechanisms in your work, including how this type of funding is not well placed to address the climate crisis in Canada. Why do you think that blended finance and other so-called innovative finance are inadequate mechanisms to address the current climate crisis in Canada and also globally?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of reasons is the problem. It's not just one little issue, it's that there are a lot of issues here. But fundamentally, we know that the climate crisis, like many of the big uh, public issues we're dealing with, they're complicated, and they require a balance of considerations, right? It's not just about how do we make the most profitable green economy. We're trying to reduce how much energy we use. We're trying to produce energy in a more sustainable way. We're trying to make sure we're not leaving workers and communities behind. There's so many considerations we need to balance in this transition, and just hoping that the market's going to solve it is unlikely to do so. But more specifically, there are issues around hoping that the private sector, that private investors are going to buy in to projects that advance the public good. And there's just no guarantee that's going to happen. And you mentioned at the outset the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the Canada Growth Fund. Like, these were initiatives by the federal government where the hope was, for every dollar of public money we spend, we're going to leverage $2, $3, $5, $10 of private capital to advance public goods. And that's just never panned out, because at the end of the day, we're just asking and hoping that the private sector is going to deliver public goods, but they won't do that unless they think they're going to make a profit. And some of these projects are just either not inherently profit making, or they are just long-term investments that aren't going to be profit making in the short term. Um, to make matters worse, we often, on the other side of things, will come in with state subsidies, state backing for private investments that would have been made anyway. We offer like a 40% tax credit or whatever, and the company was going to build that wind farm anyway, and they just get to pocket an extra 40%. That's not a very good use of public money. And then another big issue when it comes to climate in particular is that a lot of these initiatives around, again, blending finance, innovative financing, they're very much a carrots only approach. It's saying, we want to create more attractive investments for you as private investors. But there's no grappling with the root problem, which in the context of climate is fossil fuels, which is saying it's not only enough to, for example, build renewable energy. It's like we have to stop using fossil fuels. And this approach to private sector, or incentives to the private sector, just doesn't deal with that half of the equation. So, I mean, I'm all over the map here. There's all sorts of issues, but the point is that on the whole, trusting the private sector to be the main leader on decarbonization and just generally delivering public goods is just not going to work. And that's a problem with how we're moving increasingly in our public policies towards trusting the private sector.
So recently at COP29, the Canadian Minister of the Environment and Climate Change announced that Canada would invest $1.48 billion in a finance platform with the help of FinDev Canada and the Green Climate Fund to mobilize climate-focused investment in vulnerable regions of the world, but particularly in developing countries. Is Canada taking the right approach with this announcement? If so, why? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I think the most fundamental thing that we should establish up front is that loans and profit-seeking investments are not the same as aid, right? Like we're calling it climate finance, but really it's just like another place to make money. And that is problematic for a lot of reasons. I mean, again, as just as it is domestically for us, many of the most important investments that need to be made in a lot of these developing countries, just like they are in Canada, are not supposed to be profit-making investments. We need public goods. We need things like clean water and we need clean energy, but we also need things like healthcare, education, public services and public goods that we rely on. And we shouldn't be leaning on the private sector to deliver them. In fact, the private sector often won't. They'll say, well, we can make a lot more money in mining or energy production. So that's where we're going to put our investment dollar. But that may not be what communities and countries actually need from a development perspective. So there's just a real mismatch in priorities here between what the purpose of international aid is, of development finance, of climate finance, and what investors and the private markets are seeking from these relationships. The other issue is that even if, best case scenario, you have an international consortium come into a developing country and help them build clean water infrastructure, they still have to make money on that. Whereas if it's a public service, if we can just say, this is the public's going to accept the cost of this infrastructure because it's in the public interest. If you have private owners involved, all of a sudden it's like, well, we need to recoup our costs. So we're going to charge fees. We're going to extract as much value as we can from these communities to pay for our investment and to make it profit making in perpetuity. So it ends up being more costly in the long run, especially for the people who can least afford to pay it versus an upfront public investment.
So, how would you evaluate Canada's approach in involving the private sector and successfully addressing key climate issues in Canada? And following on that, if this financing approach has not worked in Canada, why do you think the government thinks that this is going to work overseas? And what's that connection between these domestic policies or failings and approaches? And what does it tell us about the government's attempt to apply similar approaches in our international development policies and programs?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't really worked, right? And we have a pretty ignominious history in Canada of public-private partnerships in the last few decades of saying, public transit and other things that we used to deliver publicly, we're going to lean increasingly on the private sector to do it. And it's been mostly, I don't want to call it a disaster. It's been a mixed bag, but it has been largely unsuccessful. And there's been certainly some big problems with infrastructure that just hasn't been built, hasn't been built well. And that ends up becoming just kind of saddling the public with problems. The best argument for public-private partnerships, for blended finance approaches, these new kind of innovative, financing mechanisms, the best argument for them is that they minimize the short-term costs to the public. A government can say we're investing in $1 billion project, but it actually only shows up on our balance sheet in the public budget as $100 million over 5 years or something. So it looks good. You offload those costs to the private sector, you offload those costs to future years, and that is politically you can see the appeal of that of not having to accept the full cost of a project. But in the long term, you end up paying for it anyway. You still have to pay for the project. And then someone has to pay for the profit that this private partner is expecting to make. And either it's going to be the public, direct, through user fees and so on, or it's going to be the state through, these kind of, again, quote unquote, innovative financing mechanisms that ensure that the private partner is not really taking on any risk. So it's a failed approach, but you can see the political appeal. But I think it's also important to note, like the broader context, like why would we do it? Like why can't the public just accept the upfront cost of what should be, frankly, necessary public investment? And that's a product of kind of decades of shifting, financial capacity from the public to the private sector. We have a private sector that's richer than ever, and a public sector with less capacity than ever in many respects at many levels. And so we're in a position where the federal government and provincial governments, governments in international contexts, they have to kind of beg the private sector for capital because they don't have it anymore. Um, and so we're in a difficult position where it is actually necessary to get private capital to build infrastructure at scale. But we're going about it in a way that's not addressing the root problem, which has been this shift of power from the public to the private sector, right? Like, yes, we do need to come up with billions of dollars, trillions even in the global context to decarbonize and deliver the kind of development aid and financing that we need to. But instead of saying we're going to, take some of that value for the public and then spend it, we're just asking the private sector to deliver those public goods, and I just think ultimately that's an approach that's not going to work.
Great. So what do you think we should do instead? And in particular, why do you think pro-public financing is key to achieving the green and just transition or green and just transitions? And can you comment in particular on why pro-public funding can or cannot address gender equality in particular? Because the monopoly of most of the literature on gender equality is really focused on the private sector. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a really important part in the context of the green transition is, I mean, it's twofold. One is that we need to be making pretty major investments across the economy that may not be profit making in the short term. We need to be investing in a lot of research and development. We should be doing that through, public funding to science, public funding to educational institutions to support R&D and things like that. I mean, we just need a lot of money to make this happen. We need to build things like, this is not a particularly exciting topic, but we need like electricity interties. So, we're trusting the market to build, a whole bunch of solar and wind and renewable power, but you got to plug it in somewhere. And if the public isn't building out a grid, then that's not going to be very useful, to have all of this new infrastructure. So that's just like one particular example of we really need to build the capacity first to enable the transition in the private sector. Like, the public has to lead so that the private sector can follow when it comes to energy and a lot of other issues here. But generally speaking, what's important to recognize is that even though things like renewable energy are becoming more cost competitive, like ultimately the reason we are trying to transition away from fossil fuels is an environmental one. It is a climate one. So just hoping that the market is going to choose to do it for economic reasons is short-sighted. Like, we need to recognize that the priority here is reducing emissions, even where it's not profitable, even where it is not economically, maximally efficient. We still need to be making investments and making regulatory decisions to reduce our emissions. So, taking a pro-public approach where finance spending is primarily delivered or at least guided by the public lets us balance these different considerations, not only economic but also environmental, also geographic. We've got a big part of the government's current approach to the clean economy is investment tax credits, saying, please spend money on clean energy, please spend money on, clean manufacturing, we'll pay you back for it. Even if that works from a climate perspective, there's no guarantee those investments are going to go where we need them. So we want to target investments in communities that are at risk, communities that currently depend on coal, oil, gas, on rural and remote communities that depend on diesel power, for example. We want to target money in these communities to support them and make sure there's jobs in those communities and that they're viable. But if you just, throw this broad-based investment tax credit on the table, what's going to happen is all that money is going to go into corporate headquarters in Calgary and Toronto. And, maybe it reduces emissions, maybe it increases investment in the clean economy, but it doesn't actually help a lot of the communities that need it. So again, that's just an example, but a reason, it's a good example of why we need to be thinking bigger picture with spending. It's not just about the total amount of money we can raise. It's about where does it come from and are we using it in a pro-social way? And then finally, I think building on that, on the gender equity point, that's something that, like, gender equity, as well as just the equity considerations in general. How do we bring more racialized workers into the fold? How do we make sure we're not leaving immigrants behind and things like that? Making sure we're prioritizing Indigenous workers and so on in those communities. All of that is more possible in the context of public projects, where again we can balance competing priorities. We can say maybe we're going to make less money building this facility in a rural Albertan community, but doing so will help the First Nations that live there. We can make sure we're providing training opportunities for women in the community, et cetera, in a way that is just very hard to do with private projects. So, making sure the public can lead can help us address all of these and balance all of these competing priorities rather than trusting it to the market, which is always going to be guided first and entirely by profit.
Is there an example that you could offer in terms of a project that has worked, a public project that's an energy project that addresses these equity concerns?
Well, I think that some of the best examples are coming out of a lot of First Nations communities right now. So I learned recently that First Nations are the largest owners of renewable energy infrastructure in the country after provincial utilities. And they're doing that with a combination of funding sources. Some of it is coming from, for example, the federal government. Some of it's coming from the private sector, and so on. But these projects are they're such win-wins when you get rural communities building their own energy infrastructure. It's economic development. It creates jobs in those communities. It makes these communities less dependent on like major corporations and colonial utilities. So there's these great opportunities here, building projects in the public interest that are owned by the communities themselves, and the benefits of then producing that electricity stay in the community. I mean, there's some really great examples of this happening, but we need to enable that and telling big, like telling Bay Street to go build energy infrastructure in First Nations communities is a very different equation than saying, how do we support these communities building their own energy infrastructure in a way that they own it and benefit from it over the long term?
So what should the Canada Infrastructure Bank be doing instead?
Yeah, well, I mean, they've changed their mandate a lot, and it has gotten better, frankly. I think, the one example of what the Canada Infrastructure Bank has done that's been better is saying we're just going to start buying electric buses. We for a long time we're trying to encourage like the private sector to do that, and we realized we just need to spend money, help these public transit systems put electric buses on the road, and so we're just going to provide money for that. So acting like a public bank, like a green bank, where you're providing low cost loans and other kinds of preferential financing to public institutions is a really good use of that money. So instead of trying to incentivize the private sector, you say, you know what, you're a municipality, you're a province, you're a nonprofit. We're going to provide you money at better than market rates so that you can do good things for your communities. And that's a great use of public funding and financing. And at the end of the day, it's maybe the community owns it, maybe the federal government has a stake in it, whatever. But the public, ultimately still owns it, and that's a really important part of this. Is not just giving money to the private sector so that they can own stuff and extract value from it, making sure that at the end of the day, the public owns public infrastructure, and the Canada Infrastructure Bank could do that, and is getting there, but it still would love to partner more with the private sector.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think that that last point is a good one to emphasize again, that our priority here, when it comes to not only the clean economy, but any kind of public infrastructure, goods and services that are meant to serve the public, they should be owned and controlled by the public as well. And there's different ways to do that, but to the extent that we are leaning increasingly on the private sector, on private investors to deliver public goods, we are ceding control of those goods to institutions, to organizations that don't care about the public, right? That's not their mandate. And that's something we have to be very careful about. It's not just about coming up with the biggest dollar figure, which is what a lot of governments want to do by partnering with the private sector. It's about doing quality work that's in the public interest, even if it comes at a higher cost.
Thank you very much, Hadrian, for sharing these thoughts with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks again for having me.